Pastor Thomas stood on the dusty streets of Denver, 1905. His sermon notes, carefully written out, felt heavy and damp in his trembling hand. The sun beat down harsh and unforgiving, much like the stares he often received. He was new here, a young man from back east, trying to start a church in a town that seemed to care more about gold than God. A crowd had gathered, mostly miners fresh from their shifts, their faces grimy with the day's work. Suddenly, a gruff voice cut through the murmur. "Look at this one, boys! Another preacher come to tell us we're all going to hell." It was Bartholomew, a burly miner with a laugh as rough as gravel. He pushed his way to the front of the small crowd, a mocking grin on his face. Bartholomew was well known, respected even, for his years in the mines and his loud opinions. He often held court at the saloon, and now he was holding court with Thomas as his target. "Your God is as absent as gold in a depleted mine, preacher," Bartholomew scoffed, his words cutting deep. He gestured around at the sparse buildings, the worn-out faces. "You think you'll find souls to save here? This town runs on sweat and luck, not on your fancy words." His dismissive tone, his clear disrespect for Thomas's calling, for his very presence in this town, was hard to ignore. Thomas felt a familiar sting, a tightness in his chest that had become all too common since he arrived. He had hoped for open hearts, but he mostly found hardened ones. Instead of rising to Bartholomew's bait, Thomas offered a quiet, almost unsettling smile. There was a glint in his eye, a flicker of something the miner couldn't quite place. His voice was low, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Some things, Bartholomew," Thomas said, his gaze steady, "once disturbed can never truly be put back." As the words left his mouth, a faint, unsettling tremor ran through the ground. It was barely noticeable, a subtle rumble that most people probably dismissed as a passing wagon or the distant blasting from the mines. But Thomas felt it. He felt it deep in his bones, a vibration that resonated with his own quiet warning. Across the street, a single small crack appeared in the rough stone foundation of Bartholomew's favored saloon. It was hairline thin, almost invisible, but it was there, a subtle omen, the narrator observes. For every word sown in malice, a deeper root takes hold. This brief, almost imperceptible moment created a strange sense of poetic justice, hinting that Thomas's words carried a weight Bartholomew couldn't comprehend. The tremor subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. Bartholomew, still laughing, clapped a few of his friends on the back, completely oblivious to the small crack, to the subtle shift that had just begun. He looked at Thomas, expecting a defeated look, but the preacher simply turned and walked away, his smile still faint, his steps unhurried. Bartholomew's boastful laughter followed him, echoing down the dusty street. He was unaware, of course, of the faint, distant creaking sound that seemed to rise from somewhere deep below the town, a sound that only Thomas seemed to perceive. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Thomas had arrived in Denver just a few months before, a fresh face in a town that had seen plenty of them, most of them looking for gold. It was 1905, and Denver was a raw, untamed place, a city born of ambition and desperation. The air was thick with dust and the smell of pine and coal smoke. Buildings, some sturdy brick, some hastily thrown together wood, lined the chaotic streets. Wagons rumbled by, men shouted, and the constant clang of hammers from new construction mixed with the distant rumble of dynamite from the mines. This was the American West, a land that promised fortunes, but often delivered only hardship. Thomas, fresh from seminary back east, had pictured something different, something perhaps a little less wild. The people here were a mix: grizzled prospectors, sharp-eyed saloon owners, tired wives, and hopeful newcomers. They were self-reliant to a fault and deeply skeptical of anything that wasn't immediately practical. Organized religion, in their eyes, often fell into the category of not practical. Life in Denver was hard. Days were long, whether spent underground in the mines, behind a bar, or haggling at the market. Evenings were often spent in the saloons, seeking a brief escape from the grinding reality. Gambling was rampant and fights were common. There was a strong sense of community, born from shared struggles against the harsh land and even harsher economic realities. But beneath that camaraderie, tensions simmered, rivalries flickered, and outsiders like Thomas were viewed with suspicion. People here valued grit and honesty, but they also valued their independence, and a young preacher talking about sin and salvation often felt like an intrusion. Thomas was young, maybe too young for a place like this. He was idealistic, his faith fervent, but perhaps a bit naive. He carried the weight of expectation, not just from his church back east, but from himself. His dream was simple, yet monumental, to build a thriving church, a beacon of hope and moral guidance in a town he saw as spiritually adrift. He pictured a place where families could gather, where the weary could find solace, where the constant pursuit of worldly riches might be tempered by a thought for the eternal. His inexperience was a heavy burden, and his deep desire to be accepted, to truly make a difference, made him vulnerable. He wanted to connect with these people, to understand them, but their world felt so far removed from the quiet halls of his seminary. Bartholomew, the miner who had publicly ridiculed Thomas, was a fixture in this world. He was a seasoned man of the earth, his hands calloused, his face etched with years of sun and dust. He had been in Denver since its boom, seen fortunes made and lost, and he embodied the hardened skepticism that Thomas constantly battled. Bartholomew was charismatic in his own rough way, a natural leader among the miners, and his opinions carried weight. He saw Thomas as an unwelcome intrusion, a soft man with soft words in a hard land. From the moment Thomas arrived, Bartholomew had been a vocal opponent. He'd seen plenty of preachers come and go, all of them promising salvation, none of them understanding the real struggles of the men who pulled gold from the earth. Bartholomew's opposition wasn't just about a dislike for religion. It was rooted in his own past disappointments, a deep-seated distrust of institutions, and perhaps a touch of jealousy for anyone who preached a life less arduous than his own. He saw Thomas's earnest efforts as a threat to the simple, pragmatic worldview that held the community together, or at least kept it from falling apart. Bartholomew's dismissiveness slowly hardened into active opposition. He would subtly undermine Thomas, spread rumors, and generally make it known that he thought the preacher was wasting his time and everyone else's. He saw Thomas's calls for temperance as an attack on the miners' few moments of comfort and his pleas for charity as a ploy to take their hard-earned money. The emotional groundwork for their conflict was laid early, with Thomas's hopeful efforts continually chipped away by Bartholomew's entrenched cynicism and wide-reaching influence. It was a battle of two very different ideas about what Denver needed, and Bartholomew seemed to be winning. Thomas often thought back to those early days in Denver, remembering the slow, grinding process that chipped away at his initial hope. It wasn't one big fight, but a series of small, almost invisible blows that left deep emotional cracks. Bartholomew had a knack for making him feel small, for making his efforts seem foolish. He remembered one crisp autumn morning when he had posted a notice for his first Sunday service. He'd spent hours carefully writing out the sermon, imagining a small but eager congregation. Bartholomew had walked past, a group of miners trailing him, and paused by the notice. He hadn't ripped it down or even defaced it. Instead, he'd just let out a loud, theatrical yawn. "Another Sunday sermon, boys," he'd boomed loud enough for Thomas to hear from inside the makeshift church. "As exciting as watching paint dry, I reckon. Me and the fellas will be down at the Lucky Nugget. They've got a new shipment of whiskey and a girl who can sing." He'd winked at his companions, and they'd all laughed, loud and dismissive. No one came to Thomas's service that day except an elderly widow and a shy young prospector. Another time, Thomas had tried to organize a small community gathering, hoping to foster a sense of fellowship. He'd secured a hall and even managed to convince a few women to bake some pies. Bartholomew had promised to attend, even shook Thomas's hand with a show of false sincerity. Thomas, foolishly hopeful, had seen it as a sign of progress. But when the evening came, the hall was nearly empty. Later, he learned Bartholomew had organized a poker game at the saloon, spreading the word that Thomas's gathering was just for the ladies and the weak of heart. The pies went uneaten, and Thomas felt a familiar ache of humiliation. Bartholomew was a master at playing on the miners' distrust. When Thomas spoke of temperance, Bartholomew would loudly declare that the preacher wanted to take away their only comfort after a long, dangerous day underground. When Thomas asked for donations to help the town's few orphans, Bartholomew would sneer, suggesting Thomas was just lining his own pockets, implying the money would never reach the children. He'd even spread a false rumor that Thomas had meddled in a miner's family dispute, causing a rift between a husband and wife. The miner, a quiet, proud man, had avoided Thomas for weeks afterward, his eyes filled with a hurt suspicion that Thomas couldn't shake. These veiled humiliations, these broken promises, weren't isolated incidents. They were a steady stream, wearing Thomas down. In a town where a man's reputation was everything, Bartholomew's subtle attacks were far more damaging than any direct confrontation. People in Denver, hardened by the frontier, didn't always appreciate directness. They preferred to observe, to listen to the undercurrents, and Bartholomew knew exactly how to manipulate those currents. His tactics reflected the harsh realities of 1905 Denver, where quiet sabotage could be more effective than a loud argument. Thomas remembered sitting alone in his small room, the faint sounds of laughter and music drifting from the saloons, and feeling utterly defeated. Each time, he'd try to tell himself it was just a setback, that he needed to be more resilient, but the weight of Bartholomew's constant undermining was heavy. The public ridicule he faced that day, when Bartholomew scoffed at his church and his God, wasn't the beginning of their conflict. It was the crushing culmination of months, even years, of psychological attrition. It was Bartholomew's final, public insult, after a long history of subtle torment, and Thomas knew, deep down, that something had to change. The emotional atmosphere around Thomas became increasingly suffocating as the months passed. His efforts to build his church, once fueled by fervent hope, were now met with a wall of escalating resistance. The town's mood, initially just indifferent, shifted slowly to open antagonism, a change largely orchestrated by Bartholomew. It felt like walking through treacle, every step harder than the last, every small victory instantly undone by a new obstacle. Thomas found himself in more direct confrontations, not just with Bartholomew, but with others influenced by him. Town meetings, originally intended to discuss things like improving the dusty roads or setting up a small community library, instead turned into public forums for Bartholomew to question Thomas's motives. "Why does the good pastor need so much money for his church?" Bartholomew would boom, his voice echoing through the small assembly hall. Perhaps he'd rather build a palace than a house of God. He'd imply that Thomas was incapable of understanding the real needs of working men. Thomas's attempts to organize charity drives for the genuinely needy were also met with derision. Bartholomew would openly suggest that Thomas was simply looking for personal gain, a way to boost his own standing, or worse, fill his own pockets. He'd make jokes in the saloon about Thomas's charity being a thinly veiled excuse for begging. The pressure on Thomas mounted from every angle. His small, dwindling congregation, those few loyal souls who still attended his services, began to question his leadership. Mrs. Henderson, the kindly widow, once his staunchest supporter, gently suggested he needed to be more practical, to perhaps compromise on his ideals to gain more followers. Even letters from his distant church superiors, once filled with encouragement, now expressed concern about his lack of progress and the slow growth of his mission. They hinted at reassigning him if things didn't improve. The isolation became profound. Even neutral parties, those who initially showed him courtesy, started to distance themselves. They feared Bartholomew's influence, unwilling to cross him and risk their own standing in the close-knit, unforgiving community. Thomas felt like an outcast, a pariah in the place he had dreamed of calling home. Bartholomew, emboldened by his successes, became even bolder and more aggressive in his opposition. He actively organized counter-events, scheduling poker tournaments and lively dances at the saloon to coincide precisely with Thomas's Sunday services. He'd spread more malicious gossip, fabricating stories about Thomas's past, hinting at scandals he knew nothing about. He even interfered directly with Thomas's attempts to secure building materials for his church. When Thomas finally found a supplier willing to sell him lumber at a fair price, Bartholomew somehow intervened, and the supplier suddenly claimed he was out of stock. His arrogance and sense of triumph grew with each perceived victory, his sneering smile becoming a constant, unwelcome fixture in Thomas's daily life. Bartholomew was enjoying watching Thomas struggle, enjoying his power over the young pastor. Thomas felt the constant weight of judgment from neighbors and even passing strangers. Their gazes, once curious, now held suspicion or pity. The once hopeful pastor who had arrived in Denver with such bright dreams was now visibly burdened. His shoulders slumped, his steps were heavier, and the light in his eyes seemed to dim a little more each day. His quiet determination, which he believed was a strength, was often mistaken for weakness by those who saw only his lack of outward success. This was the nadir of his emotional journey, a point of profound emotional suffocation. He frequently felt the ground beneath him was unstable, a subconscious manifestation of the growing unease and instability in his life and the town itself. He knew deep down that something had to give. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Then a powerful tremor, far more significant than the slight rumble felt weeks ago, ripped through Denver. It wasn't just a shake, it was a violent lurch that threw people off their feet, sent dishes crashing, and cracked walls with loud, splintering sounds. Dust clouds rose from every building, and the air filled with shouts and screams. This colossal shake shattered the established dynamic of the town, not just physically, but socially. It wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a devastating revelation. The ground didn't just settle, it tore open, exposing something truly unexpected beneath the town. Not the fabled gold veins everyone chased, but a vast, ancient, unstable cavern system previously hidden from human eyes. Now, it lay exposed, a gaping maw in the earth, breathing cold, damp air into the streets. In the immediate aftermath, as terror gripped the town, Bartholomew's reaction was chilling. Instead of showing concern for the injured or the damaged homes, he saw only opportunity. With a wild, greedy glint in his eyes, he publicly dismissed the danger, waving away fears of collapse. "It's just the earth settling," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the cries of the frightened townsfolk. "Nothing a few timbers can't fix." He laughed off the idea of any real threat, and even worse, he tried to exploit the exposed cavern. He gathered a group of his loyal miners, pointing into the dark depths. "This could be it, boys, a new mother lode. This might lead to untouched, rich veins of ore deeper than anything we've ever seen." His recklessness and utter disregard for safety were extreme, driven by a raw, unthinking greed. He was desperate to prove Thomas's warnings of impending doom wrong, to show that he, Bartholomew, was the true expert on what lay beneath Denver. Thomas, who had quietly studied geology in his youth, a hidden skill he rarely spoke of, immediately recognized the true danger this exposed cavern posed. This wasn't just a potential new mine, it was a ticking time bomb for the entire town. He tried to warn the townsfolk, his voice strained with urgency. He pointed to the shifting earth, the way the ground groaned. He even tried to present scientific evidence he remembered from old textbooks, pleading for caution, for a rational response. "This isn't a new mine, it's a structural weakness," he cried, his words echoing against the rising panic. But Bartholomew's loud, charismatic influence and the intoxicating lure of potential riches overshadowed Thomas's desperate warnings. People wanted to believe in gold, not in impending disaster. However, the tremor had another, more subtle consequence. In a less trafficked part of town, away from the main street where Bartholomew was stirring up his frenzy, the earth had also given way. This minor collapse, caused by the same powerful tremor, revealed not just another section of the cavern system, but also something else entirely. Hidden beneath years of debris and forgotten earth were clear signs of Bartholomew's past mining shortcuts. Shoddy support beams, illegal blasting marks dangerously close to the surface, and evidence of tunnels dug with no regard for structural integrity. This hidden truth, brought to light by the natural event, exposed Bartholomew's true character. It laid bare his history of prioritizing profit over safety, his blatant disregard for regulations, and his cynical manipulation of the land for personal gain. This revelation was the turning point. It finally broke the cycle of Thomas's quiet suffering and Bartholomew's unchecked, destructive influence. The natural world itself, combined with Bartholomew's arrogant hubris, provided the undeniable evidence needed to expose him for what he truly was. This validated Thomas's often ignored warnings, not through his words, but through the undeniable physical proof of the earth itself. The narrative shifted dramatically, no longer just a personal conflict between a pastor and a miner, but a larger, existential threat to the entire community, one brought about by greed and negligence. The exposure of the unstable caverns and Bartholomew's unethical practices plunged Denver into a deep chaos. Thomas, despite being thoroughly vindicated, felt a complex mix of relief, fear, and a profound sadness for the impending danger hanging over the entire town. He grappled with the heavy burden of this new knowledge and the immense responsibility to act decisively. His previous emotional suffering, the constant undermining and ridicule, was now completely overshadowed by this collective crisis that gripped everyone. The townspeople reacted in varied and often dramatic ways. Some, finally seeing the undeniable truth of Bartholomew's deceit and the danger he had put them in, began to rally around Thomas. They offered help, their hands ready for work, their voices filled with a newfound respect. These newfound allies included some of the very miners who had once blindly followed Bartholomew, now completely disillusioned and genuinely afraid for their lives and their families. They had seen the exposed shortcuts with their own eyes, the dangerous tunnels, and the cheap, rotting supports. Other townsfolk, however, remained hostile. Some were still fiercely loyal to Bartholomew, refusing to believe the evidence, perhaps out of stubborn pride or a deep-seated denial. They accused Thomas of fear-mongering, of trying to profit from the disaster, or even of somehow orchestrating the tremor itself. This clash of reactions showed the raw cultural dynamics of the American West, where self-preservation and community loyalty often crashed against each other. The initial response to the crisis was a volatile mix of outright panic and a fierce frontier resilience. Many were packing their bags, preparing to flee Denver entirely, abandoning their homes and everything they had worked for. But just as many, driven by a stubborn independence and a deep connection to their claims, refused to leave. They would stay and fight, even if it meant fighting the very earth beneath them. The conflict between individualistic freedom and the urgent need for collective safety became a central, palpable theme, reflecting the broader cultural tensions of that era. Bartholomew, once the charismatic leader, now found himself completely isolated. Exposed and totally discredited, his usual bravado crumbled and vanished. It was replaced by a desperate, pathetic attempt to regain some shred of control, or, failing that, to simply deflect all blame onto others, onto fate, onto Thomas. He faced public scorn, open contempt from those he had once charmed, and the immediate crushing loss of all his influence and his once sterling reputation. His former allies, the miners he had led and manipulated, abandoned him without a second thought. He became a pariah, a scorned figure whose name was now synonymous with disaster and greed. The psychological impact on the entire town was profound and deeply unsettling. The previous sense of stability, that unspoken trust in the ground beneath their feet, was completely shattered. Trust was broken not just in Bartholomew, but in the very foundations of their lives. Thomas, while now widely respected and seen as a leader, bore the heavy psychological weight of guiding a community through an existential threat. He often found himself reflecting on the true, immense cost of truth and the devastating consequences of ignoring clear warnings, even when those warnings came from an unexpected source. The town had changed, and so had he. The immediate crisis demanded immediate action, and Thomas, now seen as the town's unlikely savior, stepped up. He didn't just preach, he organized. He spearheaded efforts to stabilize the ground, working alongside engineers and the now cooperative miners, shoring up weak points in the exposed caverns. Vulnerable areas of the town were evacuated, and new, safer community structures began to take shape. His initial dream of building a church, a quiet place for sermons, had transformed. It was no longer just about a building, but about constructing a safer, more unified community, a foundation built on trust and shared purpose, not just faith. Bartholomew, on the other hand, faced the full, inescapable weight of his actions. Legal proceedings were swiftly initiated, not just for his fraudulent mining practices that had endangered every soul in Denver, but for the deliberate deceit and reckless disregard for safety. His assets, every last claim and piece of equipment, were seized by the town to compensate for the extensive damages, the lost property, and the sheer cost of the repairs. Stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his reputation, he was forced to leave Denver in disgrace. His name, once a symbol of success and power, was now forever tarnished, a cautionary tale whispered in the saloons. The something from below he had so carelessly sought wasn't gold, it was his own buried misdeeds, now unearthing his absolute ruin. The town, though scarred and forever changed, began a slow, arduous recovery. The tremor had forced them to confront their vulnerabilities, but it had also forged a new resilience. New building codes were quickly implemented, stricter and more mindful of the ground beneath them. A stronger, more cohesive sense of community emerged, born directly from the shared adversity. People who had once been strangers or even rivals now worked side by side, united by the common goal of rebuilding. Thomas's church was eventually built, not just as a place of quiet worship, but as a vibrant community center, a hub for town meetings, aid distribution, and even a small school for the miners' children. It stood as a powerful symbol of their resilience, their collective spirit, and their unwavering hope for the future. The resolution wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where all wounds instantly healed. The scars remained, a constant reminder of what they had endured, but they had learned, they had grown. Thomas often found himself reflecting on his incredible, unexpected journey. He had arrived in Denver a naive, idealistic pastor, clutching his sermon notes, facing ridicule and seemingly insurmountable odds. Now he understood that true faith wasn't just about delivering sermons from a pulpit. It was about action, about leadership in times of crisis, and about standing firm against injustice, even when the truth was unpopular. He recognized that true strength lay not in avoiding conflict or turning a blind eye to wrongdoing, but in confronting it with integrity, with unwavering honesty, even when the odds seemed impossible. He had learned that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the deepest cracks in the earth. The ultimate poetic justice lay in the very thing that had caused so much destruction and fear. The something that rises from below was not just a geological threat, a cavern of instability. It was the truth itself, raw and undeniable, that ultimately brought down the antagonist and elevated the narrator. The tremor, initially a symbol of chaos and impending doom, became the unlikely catalyst for a stronger, more authentic community. It had shaken them to their core, yes, but it had also forced them to rebuild, not on shifting sands of lies and greed, but on a solid foundation of honesty, shared purpose, and a newfound appreciation for the fragile ground beneath their feet. Denver had found its footing, literally and figuratively, thanks to a pastor who dared to speak the truth and a town that finally listened.